Welcome to Author Stories, the podcast where we talk to the best writers in the industry and discuss writing and the creative process. Whether you're a writer, a reader, or both, we hope you'll find something here that makes you love books and the writers that create them. You can find archives of all of the great conversations I've had with authors over the years at hankgarner.com. Take some time and browse around there. I'm sure you'll find a new author to love, find inspiration for your own creative life, and find a new story to get lost in. Let's thank some sponsors who make the show possible. Vedic by K.J. Heritage. The dead don't always die. Top company scientist Chin Jelinek has committed suicide. Vedic, a half-alive empath with no memory of who or what he is, will die in 6 hours if he can't find out why, or so the company tells him, an added incentive to get the job done. Our hero soon discovers he is one of the skilled, a genetically enhanced human revered and despised in equal measure, a bloodhound with a terrifying past who'll stop at nothing in his pursuit of the truth. And the skilled always get their guy, don't they? Vedic, number 1, by K.J. Heritage, on sale now. There's a link to it in the show notes. K.J. Heritage's uncanny sense of pacing and story puts him at the forefront of today's speculative fiction writers. Gritty, intense, and compelling, Vedic is something you don't run into often enough in sci-fi, a cerebral thrill ride you don't want to end. Prepare to lose sleep reading Vedic, delicious science fiction. That's what other people are saying about it. Find out for yourself. Vedic, the first book in the series by K.J. Heritage. Jasper T. Scott. His box set Dark Space, the complete series. This is 6 books bundled together, on sale now for 99 cents. 6 complete books, over 600,000 copies sold. More than 2,000 pages of epic space opera for the low price of 99 cents. Also available in Kindle Unlimited if you're a Kindle Unlimited subscriber. Humanity is defeated. 10 years ago, the Scythians invaded the galaxy with one goal: to wipe out the human race. Now the survivors are hiding in the last human sector of the galaxy, Dark Space, once a place of exile for criminals, now the last refuge of mankind. The once galaxy-spanning Imperium of star systems is left guarding the gate, which is the only way in or out of Dark Space, but not everyone is satisfied with their governance. Freelancer and ex-convict Ethan Ortain is on the run. He owes crime lord Alec Barandi 10,000 souls, and his ship is badly damaged. When Barandi catches up with him, he makes an offer Ethan can't refuse. Ethan must infiltrate and sabotage the Valiant, the Imperial Star System's fleet carrier which stands guarding the entrance of Dark Space, and then his debt will be cleared. While Ethan is still undecided about what he'll do, he realizes that the Imperium has been lying and putting all of Dark Space at risk. Now Brandi's plan is starting to look like a necessary evil, but before Ethan can act on it, he discovers that the real plan was much more sinister than what he was told, and he will be lucky to escape the Valiant alive. Grab all 6 books for 99 cents right now. Dark Space, the complete series by Jasper T. Scott. The Unwelcome Trilogy by R.D. Brady. Survivor, Mother, Leader, and Humanity's Last Chance. Deep within the remnants of the United States, Lila Richards oversees a camp of 200 survivors. In a world where living is an everyday struggle, and only through banding together can people survive, the arrival of the unwelcome only made her job harder. Riley Quinn and Miles Jones have been raised by Lila for the last 5 years. They're also one of the cursed, the children between the ages of 13 and 18, whom the unwelcome kill on sight. No questions, no pleas, just death. Protecting one another and the people of their camp is ingrained in all of them, but now each of them faces increased danger as the reason why the cursed have been targeted by the unwelcome slowly comes to light, and that truth will shock them to their core. Now time is running out, not just for the cursed who are being hunted down by the unwelcome, not just for Lila and her family who will face the greatest challenge yet, but for all of humanity. The world changed radically 35 years ago, but today humanity's very existence is on the line, and the fight has begun that will ensure its future or its annihilation. Fans of A.G. Riddle, James Rollins, Suzanne Collins, and Brandon Sanderson will love the Unwelcome Trilogy. Pick up your copy of the Unwelcome Trilogy on Amazon today. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm super excited to have Marie Lu on the show with me today. She has a fantastic new book. It's called Rebel, and it's the fourth book in the Legend trilogy. So super excited to talk about it. And I say that joking, fourth in the trilogy, but we'll talk more about that in just a minute. Welcome to the show, Marie.
Thanks so much for having me on, Hank.
I'm excited to have you. Marie, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
My first memory. Well, I started writing when I was 5, mostly because I had just moved over from China to the U.S. and I didn't know any English. So my mom gave me this assignment to go to kindergarten every day and write down 5 English words and come home and look them up in the dictionary and memorize them and put them into sentences. So I was always writing little paragraphs for myself to learn the language. And after I figured out what to do with those paragraphs and knew the language better, I just realized that I enjoyed the process of doing that. So very early, I just had this memory of being at home when I was like 6 or 7 and just stapling together little notebooks for myself, with like loose paper and just writing and doodling in them and pretending that they were like little books. So I guess that's my earliest memory. My earliest memory of actually wanting to consciously be a writer, a published writer, was when I was 13. And I remember the day that it happened because I was reading the paper one day, and that was another assignment for my mom, was to read the paper. And there was this article in the Houston Chronicle about this young girl who was 13 named Amelia Atwater Rhodes, who had gotten her first book deal with Simon & Schuster. And she had gotten this book deal when she was only 13 years old, and I was 13 at the time. So that was my first inkling of, first of all, that, like real people can write books. Like books in the library they don't just appear out of the ether. And my second thought was, she's the same age as me, and that means that I can also do this. So I got really excited, and I think that was the first time that I thought, well, I would like to pursue this seriously.
That's so funny. Of all of the interviews that I've done, I hear a version of that same statement a lot. That there was a day where I realized that books came from people and didn't just appear out of the ether. Isn't that weird that we have this idea about books that they're just something magical, and until we have this kind of anchoring experience that realize that these books are actually tied to people?
That is really interesting and kind of magical.
It is.
I don't know where I thought they came from. It never occurred to me. I just thought they were there and they were created from the ether and, dropped from the sky, and these magical stories came about. And then one day I was like, these are created by us, So
that's so funny.
Yeah, that is really funny that everyone else has said that too. I love that.
Do you have many memories from your time in China?
I have some. I grew up in Beijing for the most part. I was born near Shanghai, but I spent a lot of time in Beijing with my aunt living out there. And one of my clearest memories is living very close to Tiananmen Square. And it happened to be the year 1989, actually, when we left Beijing. And I was out in the square on the day that the Tiananmen Square massacre happened. We were there early in the morning. And it was something that my aunt and I did like on the weekends all the time, was to go out to the square and see what the students were doing, and to see, how their protests were happening. But as that spring went on, they got crazier and crazier. So I do have a memory of how chaotic and kind of festive that occasion was until like the day that the crackdown happened. And I remember seeing tanks out in the streets, and, my aunt said to me, maybe we should go home early today. Like, it's not a good day to be out in the square. And we went home that day. And the next day I remember that kindergarten was canceled throughout the city. So So that was like one of my clearest memories of China. Like I have lots of other memories of, riding on the back of my parents' bicycles and, going to kindergarten and, so lots of like sprinklings of memories here and there, going to the market with them to buy meat and fish and stuff like that. But it's all kind of vague, and it's been a while since I've been back. So
I graduated high school in 1989, and I remember watching the Tiananmen Square crackdowns on TV. And as being someone who I believe had just graduated high school, I forget what month that happened, but it was when
June.
June, yeah. So we had just graduated, and then watching that, and I'll tell you what, that has had a lasting impact on how I see the world and how I think about, freedom, and how I think about our personal places and the big machinery of government and life and things like that. And I think a lot of people of my generation have a similar effect. That was an indelible, image. As someone who was there and at a very impressionable age, how do you feel like that has followed you? And do you feel like that it affects your writing and the way that you see the world and the way you express yourself in the world?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I'm the same way as you. Like it was one of those events. I mean, at the time I was 5, so I didn't really understand what I was watching. I remember it was really warm and sticky that day. I remember having a popsicle because we would always got to get popsicles in the square. And I didn't think much of it until after I moved to the States. And, when I was older, I learned about it, from outside of the country. And I think about it all the time. It's just something that interests me because I had seen it from the inside of the dystopia, and then I learned about it from the outside, and it's just two very, very different experiences. And that has stayed with me, and that has definitely affected my fiction, because when you're inside of the dystopia, everything feels kind of normal. Like this is what things are supposed to be like. And it's not until you get some kind of perspective on it, whether that's stepping outside or whether you have something to compare it to, that you're like, oh, wait, that was not normal at all. This was a very unusual thing. I was just like, well, yeah, every weekend there's students in the square. It's just a thing that happens. And for the locals, at least from what I remember, it just felt like a tourist attraction almost. And my aunt was like, yeah, let's go see what they have out in the square today. And I didn't think much of it. And now I think back, I'm like, that was a very unusual time. And it's interesting, that it's also left such an impression on you as well. And it's interesting to me how the same event ripples differently through all of us, and just kind of changes our perspective on things. So I've definitely seen it show up in my writing, and that specific scene basically shows up in my first published book, Legend. And yeah, it's just, I'm sure it has something to do with, I'm interested in history. I'm interested in politics. I'm just kind of interested in how societies form and how it comes to be like that. How do you get to an event like Tiananmen Square? So.
I think I heard somewhere one time that you began Legend in its kind of seed form when you were a teenager, maybe about 15. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess technically that's true. The main character in Legend, or one of the main characters, Day, was a character that I first put into a manuscript that never sold, that I wrote when I was 15. So he had been with me in my head forever. But that book was completely different. It was a high fantasy novel, and Legend is a dystopia set in futuristic U.S. So it was a very different story. But I mean, the first seeds of that started when I was 15. But it wasn't until I was in my mid-20s or so that it was 2009 when I started writing the version that would actually be published, and that had the same main character in it, but everything else was completely different.
Working on a high fantasy novel in your teens, then going on to write science fiction and dystopian science fiction, what was the when did sci-fi and fantasy and this sort of love of genre fiction invade your life?
Yeah, this is another thing that I can kind of trace back to the specific day. I was 11. I was in middle school, and I was walking past the display case in front of our school's library. And there was a book in there called Madame Mayo, which is part of Brian Jakes' Redwall series.
Right.
It's a pretty epic fantasy series written for younger audiences about this abbey called Redwall Abbey, and it's being protected by a bunch of mice and moles and stuff, and they have to protect it from constant waves of invading marauders. And I never read fantasy up until that point. I had always read what I was assigned in school, or like Babysitter's Club and Sweet Valley and all of these kind of contemporary books. And this was the first time that I saw this kind of book, and I just remember stopping and being like, that is a really weird cover. And just kept, like, walking past this display, seeing this like mouse on the cover with a sword and this cloak, and I just kept thinking about it. And finally, I was like, I got to check this out. So I checked it out and I read it, and I absolutely loved it. Like, it became like an obsessive love. I read then I went back and read all of the Redwall books, and from there, I basically just dived right into the fantasy and science fiction worlds, like the kind of the older books, like David Eddings books and Tolkien and Robert Jordan, like all of these older series, and then leapt into the newer ones and never looked back. I just realized that this was like the genre that was calling my name all along.
I know that you initially worked in the video game industry as an animator. Is that right?
I worked as an artist and a designer.
Nice. What brought you to that career path?
It was very by accident. I feel like my whole life is kind of like
happy accidents.
Happy accidents. An accident I'm so happy that I'm relieved that it happened. Because I thought I was going to be a lawyer. I went to school and I studied political science and had applied for law school. But on the side, I had always loved playing video games. It was one of like 4 things that I did as a kid. I love to read, I love to write, I love to draw, and I love to play video games. None of which I thought were actually career options, so it never really occurred to me to do those things. And at this point I was kind of writing and getting rejected a lot. So I didn't know if I was ever going to make it in writing. So I went off to school. I thought I would be a lawyer. But when I was in my senior year, I'm about to graduate, I remember just wandering around campus feeling very sorry for myself. Like, I don't know if I want to do this with my life. Like, am I even going to be a good lawyer? And is this what I want to do forever? And I was just being very emo about the whole thing. And finally, I walked past this kiosk on campus, and I stopped because it had a bulletin on it that said, and it was from Disney Interactive Studios, and the top said, "Do you like to play video games?" And I stopped and thought to myself, yes, I love to play video games. And the second line was, "Do you like to draw?" And then the rest of it said, well, if you do, we're looking for 8 interns to join us for 6 months. And all you're going to do for 6 months paid is to come up with new video game ideas.
Heck yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, that's a job that you can get paid for? Where have you been all my life? So I ran back to my dorm room and looked up everything I could about it and put together a portfolio, and I sent it out. And then I was lucky enough to get in. And then I remember calling my mom, and I was like, "Hey mom, I'm gonna skip out on law school, and I'm gonna go work in the video game industry for 6 months with no promise of a future career." And my mom's like, "Okay." They just kind of were very cautiously supportive of that. So that's how I fell into video games, and that internship turned out to be the best thing I ever did in the corporate world. It was just an amazingly creative and fun environment to work in. And I became very good friends with all the other interns. I ended up marrying a fellow intern, so it turned out really well. And we just had the best time. And I just remember, at that time, I had been writing and getting rejected, and I had stopped writing for a couple of years because of all the rejections. But working in this creative environment for the first time, and being around a lot of other creative people, kind of gave me that inspiration back. So I really credit working in games with helping me get back on track with my writing pursuits.
So you're working in video games and you're having a great time, and this is something that is, checking all the creative boxes inside you, and I would imagine is a very fulfilling thing personally. But then this book starts nagging at you and wants to come alive. Where did Legend come from?
Yeah, I never really stopped writing, and I always knew that writing was my first love. So it was always something I was doing on the side. And it wasn't until 2009 that I started writing Legend. And at the time, I had gotten an agent, but I was getting rejected for a previous manuscript. And during that time, I was kind of trying to distract myself by writing Legend. And Legend came to be because I was watching the old movie version of Les Miserables on TV one day. This is the one with Liam Neeson in it. And and I just remember watching it and thinking to myself, it'd be really fun to do like a young version of this, like a teen criminal versus a teen detective. So like young Valjean versus young Javert. So that thought kind of occurred to me, and I thought that would be cool, and I put it aside for a while. And then a couple of months later, I was reading some article online, I think, that was talking about climate change, and they had a really interesting simulated map of what the world will look like when all of our freshwater ice melts and the oceans rise by 100 meters. And it was just a fascinating map to see because like Australia had been turned into basically two Australias, and the entire eastern half of China was gone. And in the U.S., everything from Florida up to like Virginia and the edge of Texas was gone underwater. And in California, which is where I live now, there was this huge lake stretching from LA all the way up to San Francisco. And so at the time, I just remember thinking to myself, like, well, I live in LA. It would be really fun to flood my hometown and in an environment to write about. So that's what I ended up doing. So I paired that idea of a setting with the previous idea of a cat and mouse chase between a young detective and a young criminal. And that was the first inklings for Legend. And from there, I started drafting the book.
When you start imagining how things can break down so quickly, and how I don't want to use the word spoiled, but we really do walk a tightrope of our existence, of the things we take for granted. Was that a fun thing to kind of play with? And well, if this happens, how long would it take for these things to break down? And it really gets to be interesting to look at human nature and what happens when our comforts are taken away.
Absolutely, especially now. I feel like with today's political climate. At the time, it was 2009, and Obama had just been elected, and things were feeling very hopeful. I was excited, but you could kind of see the cracks happening already in the political system. So, the Gabby Giffords was shot that year, I think, and congressional offices were getting, their windows broken, and it felt very unusual. Like this was not politics like normal. And I remember even then thinking like, these feel like little rumblings, but kind of ominous ones, and you just don't know. You take small steps that are unnoticeable until one day everything goes over a cliff, right? And you just sit there and think like, how do we get to this point? But of course, it was always building up from something. So at the time, I was developing Legend at the same time. So I was just thinking about, what if we do push this system to the extreme, and what happens if our country gets divided in two, and then from there, what would happen? If our half of our country was flooded, like how would we handle it, and where would all those people go? Would we build a wall between the southern half and northern half of the states to keep people from flooding into one area or the other? And it was one after another what if questions. As I was exploring, the world and the history that would lead up to a story like Legend. And that was very fascinating to do and kind of unsettling because I feel like all dystopia is, I mean, it's fiction, but it's not really fiction. You know, like, I feel like most dystopia out there is based on things that have already happened in the past or things that are currently happening today. So there's very little in it that's not actual fact. So, you know, a lot of these systems that I talked about in Legend have existed in the past. They've existed in North Korea. They still do. So they exist in this country. So, yeah, it's interesting playing with something that is so real and putting it into fiction. And especially now, I feel like we are just living in this surreal sort of landscape, you know, speaking of things going off a cliff, like in 2016. I think we all kind of woke up and were just like, what just happened? You know, like, how could this happen? And then we look back and we're like, oh, here are all of the tiny steps that were leading up to this horrifying thing. And now it's just very unsettling to think about the fact that we are basically living in a dystopia at this point. And you know, I know, like, America's always been founded on a dystopia. It's not like things were great back then, especially for a huge segment of the population. But right now, it just feels like we are living in a hyper reality. You know, so yeah.
What does the title Legend allude to?
The title. So the backstory for this title is that I didn't come up with it. I originally called the book Republic, which nobody liked except for me. And my agent was the one who was like, how about Legend? I feel like that fits this book better. So Legend is basically a title signifying the two main characters of the story, that they are both legends in their own right. Day, who is a 15-year-old criminal who is like America's most wanted criminal. It's kind of a legend in his own right. People make up stories about him all the time. He's almost like a mythical figure among the people. And then there's June, who is a prodigy in the military. She's kind of being groomed for perfection, and she's gotten the highest scores in the country. She's just all around like the most promising star for the government and a legend in her own right. And also about the legacy that they are about to make and leave on their country. So the title kind of envelops all of that.
So Legend grew into a trilogy, and at the end of that trilogy, in your mind, was the story finished?
You know, when I first finished the third book in the trilogy, I really did think that it was finished. I thought that I was okay with the open ending that I had left it on. And I kind of like open endings. I like the what if, and, you know,
yeah,
I thought,
do too.
Yeah, like, I like that feeling and the possibilities that it would open up for the characters. So I thought I was done, but then over like the span of a year or two, I just found myself constantly thinking back on it. Like, what did happen to them? Are they doing fine? What are they up to right now? And I would start writing these little scenes and snippets from after the ending of Champion. And I would release them online or in little booklets. And so I think my readers kind of knew that this was something that I kept revisiting. And at some point, I was just like, you know what? I don't think I quite got the closure that I needed for my characters. So I started to realize that I needed to write a fourth book because I wanted to know that things were going to be okay. And I wanted to know what would happen to everybody in the end. So the fourth book ended up happening. And it was also partly because I just wasn't done exploring the world that I had built in the third book. So that all kind of came together into the fourth book.
Well, before tackling the fourth book, you also worked on the Young Elite series and the Warcross series. Did getting away from this world and going to do something else and playing with new characters and settings and, you know, plot devices, did that help to solidify what your final statement on this series would be?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I needed that distance from the story, actually. I don't know if I would have been able to write a good fourth book if I had just started right after the first three. And especially in the writing of Warcross, I got a lot of ideas from writing that duology for writing the fourth book. Because in Champion, the third book in the Legend trilogy, I had a chance for like a couple of chapters to explore this hyper-futuristic society of Antarctica where Everything in the society is gamified. So everybody in the system has like an ultimate credit score, basically on steroids, where like everything that you do in life affects this score. So if you water a plant, you get a point. If you do well on a test, you get 5 points. And if you get in a fight, you get minus 10 points or whatever. And all of that goes into an ultimate score that the government then uses to determine where you get to live in the city. Like, do you get to buy first class tickets on the train? Do you get to go to a good grocery store? Things like that. And I spent like 2 chapters exploring that in Champion, and I didn't get a chance to scratch that itch enough. So I ended up writing this Warcross duology, which is a video game series all about a game that kind of takes over the world. And it was kind of my way of exploring how a society like that would come to pass. And I think after writing that duology, I was able to wrap my head around a book that would talk about the Society of Antarctica that I had created all those years ago. So I think writing those other series definitely gave me some food for thought for what I wanted to do with this 4th book.
Marie, why do you think we love dystopian stories so much, and dystopian sci-fi especially? And a second part of that is there are a lot of popular dystopian series that involve younger characters. Why do you think it's important that we see the world through these young people's eyes, and to have heroes that are not your typical heroes?
Yeah, I think, especially speaking as a YA author, I think that we're drawn to dystopia in fiction because it's kind of a mirror of our reality, and there's something kind of fascinating and horrifying about seeing that mirrored back at us. And in some ways, you can see things clearer. And fiction is all about magnifying certain things and using exaggeration, especially in science fiction, using exaggeration to explain like human nature and the human element. So I think that's part of it, is to understand our own world and the things that go wrong in our world, and see these stories as cautionary tales for what life could be like or already is. And also, especially for YA, especially for stories starring young people, I think, at least for me, I like to read them because I like to think that there is some ray of hope that you can solve these problems. And the thing I love about YA is that it's a quite optimistic category. The societies can get very dark, the stories can be very grim, but at the end of the day, there are some young people in there who are the silver lining in this world, and they are standing up to their governments, and they are doing amazing things in their world, and they're the ones taking these systems down. And I think it's comforting to see that, even though it's fiction, to think that, these systems are created, but they're still created by people, and they can be taken down by people. So I find a ray of hope in that. And for me, I feel like reading that kind of dystopian fiction is quite heartening. It doesn't really depress me so much. It makes me feel a little bit better about things.
Well, the original trilogy began with Legend, and then the second book was Prodigy, and the third book that wrapped it up was called Champion. The new book, the 4th one in the series, is called Rebel. Even the title is provocative. We can look at the previous 3 books, and we can kind of see a progression in the titles and get an idea of where this journey is going to take us. Rebel, what you told us kind of about wanting to continue the story and figure out where these characters went. What did you come up with, and where do we go with these characters in this book?
Yeah, so Rebel is set about 10 years after the events of Champion, and it's told from, again, the point of view of Day, but the second point of view is of his younger brother Eden, who's quite a bit younger than Day, and he was a child when the Republic's War had happened in the original trilogy, and he was a very central figure in that war, even though he was a child. But he was always on the periphery of things, so I never really got to explore this world from his point of view. So the fourth book is half of it told from his point of view, and it's about these two brothers who are dealing with the aftermath of the Republic's war and trying to start a new life in Antarctica for themselves. But they're kind of dealing with the trauma of that war very differently. Like Dave, who eventually turned into a national hero for saving the Republic, is very much eager to leave that behind and start a new life. Whereas Eden, because he was so young when everything happened, it feels a little bit like a black hole in his past. And so he's haunted by it, and he wants to revisit things. He wants to learn about where he came from and what had happened, to his family, his brother. So the two of them are at odds in that sense. And also, now that they're in Antarctica, they've kind of realized that they're living in what is being hyped up as a utopian society. This place is governed by technology. So therefore, people will say it's impartial and it's fair and it encourages good behavior and it, punishes bad behavior. And this is all a great thing. But they can see the cracks in the system, and Eden, this is kind of his chance to step out from under his brother's shadow and take things into his own hands. And so the title of Rebel is kind of symbolic of Eden's journey and awakening into figuring things out for himself and finding independence. It's about learning how to both love your country and also stand up against it and stand up to it. So, revisiting that theme that you can do both. Like you can both love your country and also rebel against it and want it to change. And in many ways that is an act of love, for where you live.
It's a fascinating thing to explore because, when you talk about America, we're literally a society founded on rebellion and rebelling to make a better place. And, in our, 200 and, almost 50-year history, it's been this constant sense of revolution. And it's a lot of fun to kind of push the clock forward and see, if we can still be who we think we are in the midst of these circumstances, and brilliantly done. Marie, you've published a dozen books or better now. How has your writing process and your creative process changed over those books?
Yeah, gosh, it's really crazy to think there's been that many books.
No, I was counting them. I was like, wow, Marie's been busy.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like that long ago, but I guess it was. It's funny. I feel like, my writing process is kind of chaotic. I'm a bit of a pantser writer, so I write by the seat of my pants, and I try to outline when I can, but I almost never follow my outlines, and I always end up, doing something else, and my characters just run off, and they're in the weeds, and I have to go fish them out, and they fight me usually the whole way through. So my first drafts tend to be very, very rough, and I have a general idea usually of where my endings will be and where the middle will be, and I have a few major scenes I know I need to hit, but everything else is kind of in the dark, and that hasn't really changed. I've tried all kinds of different methods to see if I can get a clear picture of my stories when I first start, but I almost always end up back in the swamp and have to kind of fish myself out from that. So I'm beginning to accept that that's part of my process. The one thing that has changed over the years is that I now know to expect to hate my book in halfway through writing it. And that has helped a lot because early on, especially when I was writing book 2, suddenly I wasn't just writing in this protective cave and, nobody knew about my book or anything. Now I had a real deadline. I had a contract. I had readers who were waiting for the next book. So it felt very much like writing in a glass box. And I remember at the time when I got to the middle of the book and everything sucked and my writing was awful, I was like, oh my God, I'm never going to get out of this ever. This is going to be the last book that I write and I'm a fraud. And just my thoughts, I just remember at the time were just completely panicked. But now, I still feel like that when I get to the middle of a book. I still feel like this is the book that will end me. This is the worst thing ever. Everything sucks about this book. But now at least I have the ability to tell myself, this happened for the last like 11 books that you wrote, and you've always felt like this at the halfway point. And so that means that you can push past this, and at some point you'll be able to look back and it'll be behind you and you'll have a finished book. So that has been a huge difference for me, and has meant that I can move forward more easily with my drafts and kind of have the confidence to keep going. Because otherwise I just kind of fall into this hole of eating candy at midnight and moping about this writing.
Oh man, Marie, I'm a huge fan of what you're doing. Rebel is an absolutely fantastic book that kind of launches us right back on that roller coaster from the previous books. And when you finished this book, were you more satisfied with this ending than with the trilogy?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know if I'm more satisfied. I think that it was what I needed. I still really like my ending for Champion, but I feel like now I'm at peace with this story, because I feel like I just could not stop thinking about these characters after the ending of Champion. So yeah, I guess I would like it better. Now that I'm talking it through with you, I'm like, yeah, I think I definitely feel more satisfied at the end of this one, at least for myself.
Well, and sometimes that's what you need. It doesn't, there may never be a perfect ending, but it's the one that you're satisfied with, and that you're at peace with the characters with. I absolutely love it. There's going to be a link to the book in the show notes of this episode. Marie, if folks are just learning about you and want to dig into all the stuff that you do, we're going to have a link to your Amazon page. But is there another place online where people can dig into your work and follow along with you?
Yeah, for sure. I'm on Instagram usually, and sometimes I will do Q&As with readers who send me DMs on there, and I tend to post a lot. I post stories and stuff in my feed. So I really like Instagram. My Instagram username is Marie Lu, the writer, because I guess Marie Lu is a name for a lot of other things like crackers and clothing and stuff. So it's Marie Lu, the writer. And then on Twitter, I'm there sometimes, and my name there is Marie_Lu, because somebody else has Marie Lu, and I'm sure she gets a lot of random messages.
Yeah. Well, Instagram is definitely where all the good vibes are. Twitter can feel like a dystopia sometimes.
Yeah, a little bit.
Marie, it's been a lot of fun chatting. We're going to send everyone to pick up their copy of Rebel and all of your other work. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hank. This was so much fun. You were amazing to talk to.
Now stay tuned for an audiobook excerpt from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Welcome to historic Sleepy Hollow, settled in 1640. Jason had looped around the town and had come up Broadway from the south. Behind the retaining wall next to the sign, a yard worker turned on his leaf blower, sending a tidal wave of yellow and red up and over the stones to splash off the windshield of the RV. They passed antique shops, a Shell station, and a Food King grocery. "This is the same Broadway, said Eliza. "It goes all the way down to Times Square. Used to be an Indian trail, Manhattan to Fort Orange, for the fur trapping business." She kissed the dog. "Oh, don't worry, baby. Nobody's gonna skin you. And you know what the town's most famous for?" "Well, duh," Jason said. Every kid named Crane, especially one as tall and skinny as Jason, had heard a lifetime of Ichabod jokes. He hoped never to hear another. "Did you know it was a real place?" "Of course," he said, though he hadn't. "Don't be so smart," said Eliza. "Turn here." The streets sloped towards the Hudson, the hillside trying to shake the village off its back. Jason slipped in behind a UPS truck and drove upwards. They turned onto Gory Brook Road. He stuck his head out the window, trying to pass. The UPS truck turned aside to the right. And he saw the house. "Here, said Eliza. She pointed at the driveway of 417 Gory Brook. Jason brought the RV to a smoke-belching halt. The house stood on a knoll, above a steep yard that angled downwards toward the Hudson. An ancient sycamore on the front lawn leaned precariously. The roof was an irregular A-frame, with a long slope on the left and a short one on the right, like a rotated checkmark. The upper floors were trimmed with bands of chocolate-brown wood in a rectangular pattern. They made the house look as if it were trapped behind the bars of a jail cell. A tiny triangular portico extended over the front door, which was rough-hewn, rounded on top, held together by two vertical metal bands, and dotted with nail heads. A Gothic novel in Braille. The gray-blue curtains at the ground floor bay window gave the place a veiled eye aspect, like his grandmother's cataracts. The house seemed to be inspecting Jason with that eye.
"What are you doing here, boy?" "I'm watching you."
Eliza put a hand on his shoulder. He jumped. "This is it," she said. She slapped the dashboard. "This is what?"
"Our new home."
"But—" Jason turned to her, baffled. Her face sparkled with delight.
"Surprise!"